Oh hey, didn't see you there. My name's J Money Swizzle. Welcome back to another APUSH review video. Today, we're going to be reviewing Period 7.
Yo, what's up my dudes? This is P Daddy. Today we'll be covering 1890 to 1945.
Hey, this is MT. This should be a dandy video. Cue the music. The Progressive Era lasted from 1890 to 1920. This was a time of reform in response to the negative outcomes of the Industrial Revolution and after the corruption of the Gilded Age. Progressive reformers wanted to use the federal government to enact legislation that would benefit people and society as a whole. A few of the major goals of the progressive movement included regulating big private business and trusts, improving protections for laborers and unions, eliminating political corruption, and social justice. Factories and mines were hazardous places for laborers. Labor organizations, including the Knights of Labor, the Populists, the Industrial Workers of the World, and the American Federation of Labor, used direct action and strikes in order to gain protections and benefits. Trust regulation was passed with the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. Muckraker journalists exposed corruption and defects in society. One of them, Upton Sinclair, and his grotesque descriptions of the horrible conditions in a meat packing factory in the jungle, moved the government to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Food and Drug Administration. The progressive movement dealt with environmental conservation. The City Beautiful movement for more park spaces and new drainage systems were created. Progressive leaders aimed at assisting the poor through settlement houses to help the poor with their needs and to help them advocate for themselves. The most famous was Hull House, founded by Jane Addams. Many women had active roles in social work. Political reform was another objective, but the results were mixed. Sometimes democratic participation was expanded. In some cases, it was more restricted. The major political victory was the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote. In the late 19th century, an age of imperialism rose in the United States. Part of this imperialistic fervor was based on American exceptionalism, which was the belief that the United States had the right to foster democracy and civilization around the world. Social Darwinism was another contributor to the imperialist cause. The War of 1898, also called the Spanish-American War, between the United States and Spain, showcased American imperialism in the Caribbean and the Pacific, especially in Cuba and the Philippines. The Teller Amendment disclaimed that the U.S. would not annex Cuba and stated that the U.S. would uphold democracy abroad. In the aftermath of a U.S. victory, Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the U.S. Cuba was freed, but American control remained prevalent, such as through the Platt Amendment that blocked Cuba from making treaties with other countries and gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. In the Philippines, a new war was sparked by the Filipinos who resisted the process of American annexation. This Philippine-American War ended in 1902, with more destruction than the preceding war, and the United States remained in official control of the Philippines, with William Howard Taft as the Governor General. Not all Americans agreed with imperialism. The American Anti-Imperialist League protested involvement in the Philippines. Because of a new global presence, the U.S. looked to expand its ability in trade and business. One of these places was Asia. Seeking to safeguard equal access to commerce in China, the U.S. sought an open-door policy, stating that all nations should have equal opportunity for trade with China. Between Japan, the United States agreed to the Root-Takahira Agreement, a treaty that reinforced the principles of free oceanic trade. In Latin America, Republican President Theodore Roosevelt sought to ensure American economic interest and authority by applying his big stick policy, meaning naval strength and access across two oceans. To do so, President Roosevelt persuaded Congress to purchase a strip of land in Panama in order to construct the Panama Canal, promoting American dominance in the region. The Roosevelt Corollary, in addition to the Monroe Doctrine, claimed the United States' right to police and to intervene to protect its interest in Latin America. These actions further elevated an imperialist America and more involvement in worldwide affairs.
A similar imperialist fervor hit European nations in the late 18th century, causing many nations to form a complicated series of alliances. This caused tensions to rise throughout Europe, especially in the Balkans, where heated conflict emerged between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Serbia over Austrian rule in Bosnia. The conflict lasted a long time, but the last straw took place when Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife on June 28, 1914. Austria soon declared war on Serbia and gained support from their allies Germany. Due to the complicated series of alliances, Europe's powers were soon lined up against each other: Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire versus Britain, France, Russia, Romania, and Italy. The United States, on the other hand, followed President Woodrow Wilson's policy of neutrality while engaging in trade and other commercial activities with nations on both sides of the conflict. This policy was difficult to maintain as Germany continued its unrestricted submarine warfare and sunk many American ships. Public American turned away from neutrality when a German submarine sank the Lusitania, a British passenger ship carrying a large amount of Americans. Also, the government intercepted a telegram from Germany that encouraged Mexico to join the war on Germany's side and promised that they would regain the territories lost in the Mexican-American War. Known as the Zimmerman Telegram, this message also increased tensions with Germany. President Wilson declared war on April 6, 1917, and joined the Allied forces. Congress also passed a $250 million bill for arms reparations that intended to make the country ready for war. Over 1.3 million men and 20,000 women enlisted in the armed forces, as many believed that they had a civic duty to support the war effort. Government propaganda encouraged enlistment through patriotism and civic values, and the Selective Service Act was enlisted in 1917, which was well received throughout the country. The home front was largely affected by the war effort, as women's rights activists linked their newly important roles in the war effort for a voting rights amendment. This amendment was passed in 1920 and became the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Hypervigilance also emerged in the U.S. as many began to accuse and threaten groups whose loyalty to America was questionable. These groups included socialists, German Americans, labor activists, immigrants, African Americans, and especially communists, who sparked the revolution in Russia in 1917. This period of communist fear became known as the First Red Scare, which lasted until 1920. Civil liberties were also affected as Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which made the expression of anti-war sentiment and government criticism illegal. The economy was also affected as it went from a period of recession to 44 months of boom. This was largely due to the abandonment of neutrality as economic interactions with European nations and wartime manufacturing increased. The war ended in 1918 when Turkey, Austria, Hungary, and Germany were forced to reach an armistice. The peace settlements, known as the Treaty of Versailles, reassigned German territories and forced the German government to pay hefty reparations. It also created the League of Nations, an intergovernmental peacekeeping organization. The Senate refused to sign the treaty and joined the League of Nations for their desire to remain isolationist. President Wilson, however, expressed in his 14-point speech that the U.S. should join the League of Nations and expand its role in the world in order to keep peace. Congress's determination to remain isolationist led the U.S. not to join the League of Nations despite emerging from the war as a world power. After a short period of inflation, the post-war economy boomed. This trend continued until 1929, as the 1920s was a time of new opportunity and prosperity for many Americans. Known as the Roaring Twenties, this time also saw the emergence of a mass consumer culture due to the emergence of the automobile, radio, appliances, and Hollywood movies. This consumerism allowed many to gain access to large amounts of consumer credit, as their large spending put them into debt that they could pay back later. This debt, however, was a large cost of the stock market crash in 1929. The economic prosperity of the Roaring Twenties soon came to a halt in October 1929, as the stock market crashed and the economy soon fell into a deep depression. Known as the Great Depression, this period was the worst economic decline in U.S. history and saw many people fall into poverty. The turn towards the Depression began in the spring of 1928 when the federal government increased federal spending sums and continued through a slight recession in 1929. Also, the federal government increased rates in order to preserve the declining value of the dollar, which made money harder to get and caused bankruptcies. In addition, banks failed as investors drew all their money out. This significantly added to the growing panic. The president at the time, Herbert Hoover, was seen to be the savior of the Depression as he had created a successful food rationing program during World War I. However, his belief that the economy would work itself out and encouragement of Americans to work their way back to prosperity was a miserable failure. In 1930, he established the President's Emergency Committee for the Unemployment to coordinate the efforts of local welfare agencies. He also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided railroads, banks, and other financial institutions with money for loans. Despite their efforts, this legislation simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of the Depression and proved unable to make a significant impact. Life during the Depression was miserable for many as unemployment reached a record high 25% in 1933. Many farmers lost their farms and were affected by a large drought and poor soil, creating an area known as the Dust Bowl. Conditions here are miserable as many workers sought to find work on the West Coast. Others moved to poor shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. When the election of 1932 came around, Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt won in a landslide, as many blamed the Depression on Hoover and the Republicans. This marked the end of a Republican-dominated government and a shift to the New Deal Democrats.
The New Deal was created to combat the effects of the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented the New Deal in 1933 with the intention to enact a series of programs that expanded the government's role in the economy. The New Deal is summed up into three main R's: relief, recovery, and reform. The New Deal is considered split into two sections also. The first New Deal, ranging from 1933 to 1934, and the second New Deal, ranging from 1935 to 1938. The first New Deal began with FDR's The First 100 Days. The legislation passed in this time targeted the bank crisis, unemployment, and industrial performance. The acts passed were the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the National Recovery Act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second phase of the New Deal targeted worker protection and financial security. The acts involved were the Works Progressive Administration, the Wagner Labor Relations Act, the Social Security Act, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. The New Deal was only partly successful, as most acts were shot down by Supreme Court. This led to FDR to attempt to pack the Supreme Court by trying to expand it to 15 justices. Although the New Deal was a step towards ending the Great Depression, it didn't officially end till World War II. World War II spanned from the years 1939 to 1945. The main two sides were Axis powers, which were Germany, Italy, and Japan, versus the Allies, France, Great Britain, US, and the Soviet Union. The war was the bloodiest and largest war in history. Adolf Hitler led the Germans in hopes to clean the earth of inferior races and dominate control over the world. With the brink of war abroad and discrimination at home, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 on June 25, 1941, to prohibit discrimination in defense industry. At the start of the Second World War, America had a foreign policy of isolationism. They did not wish to get involved with the war and other countries' battles. However, on December 7, 1941, tragedy struck America's homeland. On the day that will live in infamy, Japan surprise attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This day changed the tide of the war as America dropped their policy of isolationism and declared their participation in World War II. America's President Franklin Delano Roosevelt led America through the war and built close partnerships with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin to fight the Nazis. In FDR's State of the Union address, he claimed that this war was a fight for four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of want, and freedom from fear. Although he stressed freedom, FDR issued Executive Order 9066 amid the concerns that Japanese Americans posed a threat during the war. This order relocated 112,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps, losing everything they've worked for. Although Japanese Americans suffered greatly from the war, women in America benefited greatly. Between 1940 and 1941, 5 million women entered the workforce due to men leaving for the military. Many women joined jobs in defense plants and factories around the country. Although they still got paid less than men, their wages increased significantly and many achieved financial reliance for themselves. The face of the working woman was Rosie the Riveter, a tough yet feminine lady. As well as finding jobs in factories and offices, many women also joined the military, working as nurses, truck drivers, and flew planes from factories to military bases. African Americans' way of life changed greatly in this time as well. The Great Migration was a movement of millions of black people from the rural South to the urban North. They were able to find jobs in factories during the wartime economy. In the early 1940s, the U.S. began to work on one of the greatest projects ever seen, the Manhattan Project, was a secret U.S. development of the atomic bomb during World War II. FDR created a committee to develop the bomb after being urged by Albert Einstein. Even though the Allies defeated the Nazis in May 1945, Japan had no intent of surrendering. America didn't want to assault Japan again because the U.S. would have mass casualties, so they decided to implement their new project. On August 6, 1945, President Truman ordered the dropping of the first ever atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing 140,000 people. Then, on August 9th, U.S. dropped another bomb on Nagasaki, killing 80,000 more. This second attack resulted in Japan surrendering 6 days later, ending World War II. Although nuclear warfare helped end the biggest war the world has ever seen, it started another worldwide conflict, the Cold War.
Thought bubble. If you ever wonder what life was like for an American soldier during World War II, more than 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the war, but less than 1 million saw serious combat. Those that did see combat, however, faced brutal conditions. 7 out of 10 infantrymen died in battle, and they bore the brunt of the fighting. Also, they had to do physical labor such as transporting supplies that helped us win the war. While marching across Europe, soldiers had to sleep on hard surfaces and sought to remain dry at all times during wet conditions. Food rationing frequently ran scarce as well. Life for soldiers in Southeast Asia was worse, as fighting took place on rural islands where soldiers were bogged down in filthy conditions. The heart and determination of the American soldiers to persevere through these conditions was crucial in the Allied victory.
So does anyone know how to write a historically defensible thesis?
Ooh, I do. Me.
Yes, Nick?
All you have to do is just restate the question and make sure it's not historically defensible.
Wrong!
Ooh,
Matthew.
To answer a historical question, the thesis statement must address all parts of the question and present a claim that can be supported by relevant evidence. When crafting a thesis statement, the writer's position should be clearly stated, providing a structure to what the following argument will be about.
Yes, good job, you are correct.
Yes!